Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. And this episode has turned into a debacle. So here's what's going on. This episode was supposed to be all about the air-fuel ratio and how to kind of go about installing this thing on your car to get a reading. The episode after that was supposed to be a test drive where we can really pay attention to the air-fuel ratio as we drive the car. And then the third episode in this little mini-series was going to be the tuning episode. Because, I was fairly certain that I wasn't going to get the readings that I exactly wanted from the test drive, so it's helpful for us to learn how to adjust it. So here's what really happened, and later in the episode, I will still show you guys, the intended opening of this episode and everything that I've done to get to this point, which honestly, I think you guys will just find funny because nothing really went the way that I expected. So what ended up happening was I was just going through the installation of this AEM air-fuel ratio gauge, and I have it hooked up directly to the battery here because all I wanted to do was check that this gauge was working before I got inside, started drilling holes to mount the gauge and give this a permanent home inside the vehicle. And I found out that my engine was running really, really lean, which stopped me kind of dead in my tracks and kind of forced me to jump into troubleshooting mode, which again I was kind of hoping that I wouldn't have to do until after the test drive. But there's no sense in taking this car out for a drive right now because we know that it's going to run lean or way too lean. So at this point, I'm pretty much enlisting your help. Let's turn this into a team activity. Mostly for my sake, but hopefully others can kind of learn from this troubleshooting exercise as well. So, like I said, the car is running really lean, and I'm going to try to explain everything that I've done, or summarize everything that I've done and everything that I know about the car so that you guys can make pointed suggestions or advice on what I should be doing next to get the air-fuel ratio to close to 14.7, which is what we want to see, at least at idle. So the engine is really running really lean. And my first instinct was that maybe the airflow meter is faulty. I've never bench tested this thing, and this is the original unit that came with the car. But I thought maybe the airflow meter was sending wrong signals to the ECU about how much air was entering the system. So what I tried doing was swapping this extra AFM that I had just laying around. Where I got this was from the same previous owner of this extra L28 engine that I've been working on. And this guy was basically swapping out the L28 for a Chevy V6. So he had taken out a lot of the different components. And when I picked up the engine, he basically said I can take whatever I want for free. So I picked up this extra AFM unit. So I never bench tested either one of them, but my hypothesis was that, if the AFM is what's causing the mixture to go lean, if I swap out the AFM and get like drastically different readings, at least I can pinpoint the problem to the AFM and going about tuning it, seeing if I can adjust it that way. Long story short, once I got to cleaning off all of the connections on both of the units and swapping them back and forth, I essentially ended up getting very similar readings. Not identical, but no matter which AFM that I use, the engine is still running lean. So it doesn't really negate out the AFM as a potential problem, but it is I guess kind of coincidental that if that was a problem, both of the AFMs would be producing exactly the same readings on the ratio. And then I kind of thought through what else could be going on. So we did do a fuel pressure test on the car, and it worked out almost dead on exactly what we needed to see. We also measured the vacuum on the car. And if you guys remember, we read anything from 17 to 18 while the car was idling, which is a little bit on the low side, but it's nothing to be concerned about. So I kind of want to rule out a vacuum leak as a potential issue. you know, we could still have a vacuum leak. I mean, we didn't test the vacuum at different points in the RPM, so maybe there's a vacuum leak in the engine that's getting exacerbated as we rev it up. But I don't think the vacuum leak is an issue either. So that really brings us down to, if we think through everything that the ECU is trying to read to determine the air-fuel ratio, it's the coolant temp sensor, which, you know, like I did replace the coolant temp sensor. I don't know if I replaced it with a Nissan made stock unit. So it could be that I installed a wrong coolant sensor. And maybe that's the thing that we need to test. I kind of wondered if the gauge was working properly. So I pulled all of the plugs to corroborate that story. And the spark plugs do look like or do tell me that the engine is running a little bit on the lean side. So this is cylinder number 2, this is cylinder number 3, and both of them are pretty white. So the spark plugs do kind of corroborate the evidence that the engine is running lean. So getting back to the coolant temp sensor, what we can do is pull out the coolant temp sensor and do a resistance test to see that it's putting out this the right resistance. But what we can also do is install this. I actually don't know what this is called, but it basically changes the resistance reading of the coolant temp sensor to fool the ECU into thinking that it's either colder or hotter than it actually is, so that it's forced to adjust the fuel mixture. But this is really more of a band-aid solution. I don't want to resort to this if we can identify the actual problem and fix it. So that's kind of the summary of what I've been thinking through so far. If you guys have any thoughts, again, I really hope that you guys will comment down below. I will respond to every single suggestion and advice, and I will follow up either by commenting or actually creating a follow-up video on me doing the test that is suggested or checking through things that you guys advise. So I hope this will be a productive exercise, and hopefully we can get the air-fuel ratio within a reasonable level and then do some further tuning. So right now I am going to show you the original opening of this episode so that you guys can see everything that I've done to get to this point. Whew. Hey guys, welcome back to the garage. It is a rather cold night, or Friday night, here in Virginia, and instead of hanging out with my friends like a normal person, I'm in here trying to work on the car by myself, talking to myself. But I am nonetheless excited because we're finally at the air-fuel ratio part of the engine tune-up procedure checklist, which is a must-do before we get to the dyno. However, it is a bit of a complicated topic, so we'll try to break it off into 3 different episodes. Episode 1, we are going to unbox this AEM wideband air-fuel ratio gauge. And I'll show you everything that gets included in this kit and walk through how to install it on your vehicle. Episode number 2, or tomorrow morning, we are going to go on a test drive and take notes on what this gauge tells us throughout the drive. And you guys can tell me if you guys like the readings or if I should be worried about the readings. We really just can't shoot that right now because the video feed is going to be all grainy because of the darkness, and I don't even have working taillights on this car, so we'll probably just get pulled over. Episode number 3 in this mini-series is going to be learning how to adjust your air-fuel ratio, and we'll bumble through that, and that's really the most important part of all this, because what good is knowing what your air-fuel ratio is if you don't know how to adjust it, right? So those are the 3 episodes, and in this episode we are going to first go through what this box holds. So like I said, this is the AEM air-fuel ratio gauge. So first in this box is the installation manual, which contains a lot of good information in it, so you guys should read this cover to cover for your own edification. But this is going to be a pretty simple install. This is the gauge. This is a digital unit, it's not analog. I don't know if there's any analog gauges for the air-fuel ratio. but it's a pretty nice looking unit. But if you don't like the black faceplate, it also comes with a white one, which we won't be using because everything else in the car is black, so it's going to look weird if we use this. So we'll just keep the black faceplate. And it does come with its own oxygen sensor that it's made to work with. So this is the wideband oxygen sensor. It's a Bosch unit that the gauge is made to work with, which is nice, so you don't have to purchase that separately. And this is a connection that goes from the oxygen sensor to the gauge. It's just a simple plug and play. This is the power cord. It has 4 wires on it. Of course, red is for the positive and black is for the ground. But I think these 2 wires you will want to use if you're planning to hook this up to an ECU, so that your ECU can also get the information from the oxygen sensor, which we won't be doing because this is a 280Z, and 280Zs never came with an oxygen sensor though, so we won't be using these 2 wires, which makes this thing even simpler. And there is an oxygen sensor bung that's included. This is a pretty standard size. You will need to weld this onto your exhaust pipe if you don't have one already. There's also some crimp connections, which we won't be using because we'll be soldering. And there's also a sticker that I will probably just put on my toolbox. So the first thing that we're going to do is check that this gauge actually works and that we didn't get a defective unit. So all we need to do to turn the gauge on is it just simply needs a power source. So we have a 9-volt battery here with some alligator clips, and this thing should function without having to be connected to the oxygen sensor. So we just plugged in the power cord, and we can hook up the positive side of the battery to the red wire and the negative side of the battery to the black wire. And your gauge should turn on like this. And without any input from the oxygen sensor, it's telling me that it's right at stoic, which is 14.7. So now that we know the gauge works, we can go ahead and try to install this oxygen sensor. So a quick note on the placement of the bung and the oxygen sensor, which is a fairly frequently asked question, and it's important that you get this right so you can get good readings. If you're only planning to run one oxygen sensor for one gauge, you need to have it placed at the portion of the exhaust pipe, which is after all of the individual exhaust runners have collected into one pipe. And that is, of course, so that you can measure the air-fuel ratio on the entirety of the engine and not just a few cylinders. Of course, it's a different story if you plan on running multiple gauges to pinpoint out what your ratio is at different parts of the engine, but we're not doing that. 2, you want to have it placed before the catalytic converter. Of course, we don't have a cat on this car, and I imagine a lot of Z owners don't, so you don't need to worry about that. But it does kind of need to be fairly close to the header. So I have mine placed right after the header. And 3, it needs to be angled slightly. So there's a nice little picture for this in the instruction manual. Basically, you need to have the oxygen sensor at least 10 degrees pointed downwards from horizontal. And I think this is to protect the sensor from like water or fuel that might be present in the exhaust pipe. So those 3 things you need to remember, especially if somebody else is installing the bung for you. You need to mention those 3 things so you can get the right readings. So we're now going to thread this oxygen sensor into the bung. And there's already anti-seize applied to the thread, so you don't have to worry about that. Sorry about the terrible lighting. Good morning, guys. It's actually the morning after. While I was installing this oxygen sensor in the exhaust, one of my neighbors came over to say hello, and that turned into a 2-hour long conversation on this car, and he's a car guy himself, so he was telling me all the projects that he had in mind, which was a awesome conversation. But after that I was really tired, so I just went back inside and went to sleep. So we do have the oxygen sensor installed, and if you're planning to install the gauge inside the car, you really need to run this through the firewall, or at least run this cord which connects to the oxygen sensor and the gauge through the firewall. It might be easier for you to run this through because this is pretty thick, and I don't think you're gonna have an easy time shoving the oxygen sensor through the firewall either. But we're not gonna do that right now because we just wanna check that this gauge actually does work. We're just going to see what the sensor says outside of the car before we go back inside and start drilling holes for this mount. So we are going to unravel this a little bit. So we're gonna plug this in to the sensor, plug the other end to the gauge, and we'll need to provide a 12-volt battery source or power source to the gauge because 9 volts is not going to function properly. So we're actually going to hook it up directly to the battery for now. So again, we're going to take these alligator clips, connect this side to the black wire. Any ground will do, so we'll just use this bolt. Hopefully that works. And the positive side to the positive side of the battery. By the way, this battery cover flung open while I was test driving, and the only fix that I could manage to do while I was on the side of the road trying to fix this was this rubber glove that I happen to be wearing, so I just made a loop. That's what that is. And we're going to connect this to the positive side of the battery, and there it is. The gauge is working. So let's point this. Well, we'll just leave this right here. We'll turn on the car and see what it says. So, of course, let's talk about what we're supposed to be seeing. When the engine turns on, it's very cold right now. It's like 36. Okay, it's not that cold, but it is cold. So what the car is going to do is inject extra fuel into the engine using the cold start valve. I never verified if my cold start valve was working, but that's what's supposed to happen. So the car is going to inject extra fuel to get it to start, and when it's warming up, I imagine it's going to be on the rich side. So 14.6, 14.7 is stoic, so that's where that's the ratio that you want to see when the engine is all warmed up and just under really little load and idling. But the car will probably start around 13, maybe even lower, and we should be able to see that this levels off. Like the ratio increases, or the air-fuel ratio increases as the engine gets warmed up. So that's what I'm expecting to see. But let's see what actually happens. that was interesting to say the least. The engine is running way too lean, like off the chart lean. And this is actually kind of embarrassing because I've been telling you guys that the engine is running a lot better, and it's not. Well, it is. It's running better than before, but it's running still way too lean. So I'm gonna actually stop installing the gauge right now because we have a problem that we need to tackle. We can't really even take this car out for a test drive because we're just not gonna get anything. We're just not gonna get a reading that's meaningful. So here's what I'm gonna do. Or here's what we know. So we checked the fuel pressure. It's at a pretty good level. We checked the vacuum, again, at a pretty good level. So what this tells me is that there's some component that's malfunctioning. Either something is sending the ECU the wrong information or the ECU itself is faulty. And the easiest thing for me to just test right now is actually to replace the air fuel meter, or sorry, I keep saying air fuel meter, the air flow meter. This is basically a junkyard unit that I got for free when I bought the extra engine, and it is really, really dirty. But I'm gonna clean this up and try just swapping it out with my AFM that's in the car and see if anything changes. This is the exact same airflow meter. It has the exact same part number. So maybe something will change. I don't know. If this doesn't work, we'll actually have to rip this plastic open and get to a little bit more detail in diagnostics. But let's just try swapping this out and see what happens. First, I'm gonna need to clean it up because there's all kinds of just spider webs and gunk in here, which I don't want going into the engine. The unit itself seems to be I don't know, it's dirty, but it's not sticking. It has a smooth motion. So I'm hoping that nothing needs to be adjusted. And let's just see what happens. I'm gonna take some carb cleaner and run it through it just in case. And maybe some compressed air. Alright, well that looks a lot cleaner already. I'm gonna take this mounting plate off because we already have one in the car. And I really hope this improves the ratio because this is like my biggest nightmare. I was afraid that we were going to see something that clearly wasn't right. And I've been driving the car around quite a bit, so I'm hoping that I didn't do lasting damage on the car by driving it while the ratio is just clearly so lean. But well, we all learn somehow. We're just gonna take a metal brush and clean off the contacts a little bit. Alright, here's the old unit going in, so we need to pull out the new one. Or not the new one, the one that's in the car. Alright, here's the old one. And I wonder if the connections were just bad. That plug, I don't know, it seems to be in decent condition, but I don't know, I see a little bit of corrosion. Alright, so I'm just gonna spray this electronic cleaner in the plug. I don't know, I'm pretty sure this isn't the problem, but we might as well do this while we're in here. There's really nothing I hate more than these plugs in the car. It's just so hard to reset. And when it's cold outside and you have shaky hands, this is just a nightmare. By the way, Dave, I know you have a AFM testing video. I watched it just out of curiosity a while back, but I might have to watch that again and see how you went about testing the AFM, because mine might be faulty. And while we're doing this, we might as well switch out this old dry rotted air hose, because I have a silicone unit that I think it's supposed to fit. We'll just have to cut it to length. So we have the extra airflow meter connected on to the intake manifold. It's just kind of hanging on by one bolt right now, but that's okay. And I'm not going to bother with reinstalling the air cleaner, because we'll just be running it for a few minutes. So let's start the car and let's see if anything changed. Yeah, I forgot to reinstall the coil plug. Alright, now let's get it started.